What we're going to do now is we're going to graph sine and cosine. We've talked about how to plug in the values in the calculator. And when we plug in the different values in the calculator, these are all in radians. What we're going to do is we're going to get these y values, plugging them into the theta. So that means that 0, or sine of 0, is 0. When we plug in pi halves, sine of pi halves would be 1. Sine of pi is 0. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. And sine of 2 pi is 0. Now, this graph continues to follow that pattern to 720, whether we add 360 or subtract 360. So it completes that cycle. So what we're going to talk about later is the period, which is 2 pi. That means it's repeating all the values every 2 pi. How that helps us is that we're just going to graph the first part of sine. So that means that the highest value is 1 and the lowest is negative 1. We're going to start off at 0, and we have 0, 0. At pi halves, or 90 degrees, what we have is 1. At pi, or 180 degrees, we have 0. At 3 pi over 2, or 270 degrees, we have negative 1. And then at 2 pi is 360. Or remember, it's the same thing as 0. 0 and 2 pi are always going to have the same answer. So our graph is going to look something like this. Now with cosine, if we were to plug the values into the calculator, 0 is 1, pi halves is 0, pi is negative 1, 3 pi over 2 is 0, and 2 pi is 1. Once again, these are in radians, so if we were to plug those into our calculator, these would be the y values that you would get. Once again, this is our parent equation, so all the cosine values are going to be based off of this right here. It's ending at 2 pi, and this, just like sine, the highest is 1 and the lowest is negative 1. With cosine, though, it starts at 1, then it goes to 0, negative 1, 0, and back up to 1. So when we graph this, what we get is something that looks like this. Now let's look at a couple examples. We're going to be looking at sine and cosine values that have different c values. The c value is our vertical translation, or it's called our midline. This shifts the graph either up or down. The horizontal center of the graph is the c value. And so whatever the midline is, that is our c value, and that's also the middle of the graph. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a table. This table is going to be based off of our sine values that we had before. So our sine values before were 0, 1, 0, negative 1, and 0. What we're going to do is we're going to add 2 to each one of those. So when we plug in 0 for sine, it gives us 0, but when we add 2, we get 2. The sine of pi halves is 1, but when we add 2, we get 3. The sine of pi is 0. When we add 2, we get 2. The sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. When we add 2, we get 1. The sine of 2 pi is 0. When we add 2, we get 2. So when we graph this, notice that it's not 1 and negative 1. What we have is it going up to 3 and down to 1. So I have 0, 2. I have pi halves and 3. I have pi and 2. I have 3 pi over 2 and 1. And then I have 2 pi and 2. So this right here is my sine curve. Now, when we're looking at cosine, just like sine, the process is the same. I don't know why I put X on that. So when we're looking at this, we have 0, we have pi halves, we have pi, we have 3 pi over 2, we have 2 pi. Now remember, our cosine values are 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. What we're going to do is subtract 1. So the cosine of 0 is 1. When we subtract 1, we get 0. The cosine of pi halves is 0. When we subtract 1, we get -1. The cosine of pi is -1, minus 1 is -2. The cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0, minus 1 is -1. The cosine of 2 pi is 1. When we subtract 1, we get 0. So when we're graphing it, this time our max value is 0 and our minimum is -2. 0, 0, pi halves -1, pi is -2, 3 pi over 2 is -1, and 2 pi is 0. So that right there gives us our cosine curve. Now our last one, what we're going to be doing is subtracting 3. So once again, we're going to create our table. We have 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Now, remember, our sine values are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. Since we're subtracting 3, we're going to take the 0 and subtract 3 to each one of these. So when we graph this, our maximum value is -2, and our minimum is -4. So 0, -3, pi halves -2, pi is -3, 3 pi over 2 is -4, and 2 pi is -3.